The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, our topic is what it's like to be a skeptical psychic. And with me is Nancy du Tertre, who is known as the skeptical psychic. She is the author of Psychic Intuition, What You Always Wanted to Know But Were Afraid to Ask. And she is also the author of How to Talk to an Alien. In addition to her professional practice as a psychic, Nancy is also a corporate attorney. Welcome once again, Nancy.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, we're going to enjoy this interview, I'm sure. I know you have developed a complete methodology around working as a psychic and being very systematic, and you've explored the remote viewing research. You're very familiar with protocols, and yet, to me, there's a paradox involved in being a skeptical psychic, and I know you've addressed it, and that is that, to me, in order to do psychic work, you want to enter into a state of mind where your skepticism is put aside, at least temporarily. That it could, because the intellect in general interferes with psychic functioning.
I think what's really important is you have to figure out what does it mean to be skeptical. Mm-hmm. What's the value in it?
Yeah.
And I think what I've learned is that being skeptical tends to mean that we don't accept those things that don't make sense. Mm-hmm. In other words, some of the best psychic work that anybody ever does is complete nonsense. And then you have to understand, why is it nonsense? Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
It normally doesn't make sense to the psychic or the viewer or whatever, but very often it makes perfect sense to whoever the client is or whoever the intended recipient is.
Well, it's interesting, even the very phrase makes sense. We're invoking the notion of empiricism. That is, if we see it through our 5 conventional senses, then it's considered real. If it doesn't comport with our normal sensory experience, it's nonsense.
Right. And I actually, when I taught psychic workshops years ago, mm-hmm. one of the little exercises that I would give people, I would give them, the Jabberwocky poem. Mm-hmm. Anything that is, the words don't make sense. They're not real. Yeah. They're sort of real. They feel quasi-real, but they're really not. Yeah. And then you're talking about mythical creatures that don't exist, and yet they seem to be doing things that make sense. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea is scramble your brains, because mm-hmm. that's how you get to the data.
Yep.
And when you are a logical person and you pride yourself on being rational and actually having a basis for believing anything, mm-hmm. it feels awful.
Well, nonsense is very important, I think.
It's super important, yeah.
In fact, there are many different kinds of nonsense. There are probably at least a dozen different categories of nonsense, as you mentioned, ranging from Jabberwocky, which is only slightly nonsensical, to things that are completely unpronounceable.
Right. Mm-hmm. And all you have to do, if you want to get good at this type of work, mm-hmm. And at some point, if you get good, you'll start to realize that it has tremendous value.
Yeah.
If you don't get good at it, it's really hard to recognize the value because you're still judging by different standards. But if you allow yourself to feel and say things that you don't understand and take the risk, for me, this was the hardest part, take the risk of appearing really dumb.
Yeah.
I hate appearing dumb. Because I grew up in a background where you had to back up everything you said. And I can't back up any of this stuff. I can't, or some of it I can, but very little.
Right.
And it's only when you get to the feedback stage when you start to say, oh, that makes sense. I get that.
Yeah.
I mean, I did a reading for somebody just recently, and the reading had to do with they were interested in knowing about future career or something, classic question. So I hear a name, and when I say hear, I mean in my mind's ear, a certain sound is formulated, and I write it down, and it sounds like a name. And let's say for argument's sake, and it was a weird name. Let's say for argument's sake, it's a name like Kenilworth.
Okay.
Doesn't mean anything to me.
Right.
Nothing to do with what this client asked, as far as I'm concerned. And so I mention this to the client because I feel an obligation to mention all nonsense. And there was almost dead silence. And she said, well, that's the name of the street that my current job location is, where their offices are.
I see.
I then named certain people in this client's office. I didn't know what I was naming. For me, it meant nothing. So you have to take the risk of saying something that means nothing to you and you don't know how to tie it in.
What I'm hearing here is almost that the more nonsensical it is, perhaps the more likely it is to be accurate because it's nothing that your logical mind could have come up with.
Right. And that was Ingo Swann's big issue, what he would call analytic overlay in remote viewing. And that was his, stay as far away as possible from what he called the AOL. And anytime you thought you were actually recognizing something because you could put together the pieces, your logical mind could, throw it in the garbage can.
AOL meaning analytical overlay.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I have learned in a method that I am developing and have been developing for a long time, different type of remote viewing, but a little bit more complex, I would say, than some of the controlled remote viewing or the associative remote viewing. I bring back some of those elements, such as what they call front loading, which is another, oh God, no, you don't want to add in too much front loading because then you know too much. And when you know too much, you're apt to do this analytic stuff.
Well, for our viewers who don't know what the term means, it's about getting information about the target person or the target subject in advance of doing the reading.
Right. It's any background you get and you're told or advised of before you start doing this magical thing, called remote viewing. But I add that back in because I'm not afraid of it anymore.
Okay.
I now know how to use every single one of my skills. So I'm using my training, and I trained for 10 years in psychic detective work, trained in mediumship with mediums from all over the world, trained in physical mediumship, trance mediumship, medical intuitive, and remote viewing, different types. So I'm pulling together my psychological training, psychic training, mediumship, even some of my legal training, believe it or not, comes in handy. And so I don't mind thinking, but I'm really careful the way I think.
Okay.
And sometimes when I get enough strange data, let's say, or nonsensical data, what I do is I decide to permit my logical brain to free associate, to make enough sense out of something so that when I present this information to a client, I'm not saying, oh, orange, squiggly, feels tall. Do you know what that is? And they're looking at me like, I paid for this? You have to somewhere put together information in a cohesive way, not to say that I accept my interpretation. Ultimately, it's the client.
Well, there's a world of difference, I think, between doing remote viewing using that specific protocol for the purposes that remote viewers use it, and doing a reading for a client who is either with you on the telephone or in front of you physically.
Right. Well, that's why my system is different.
Yeah.
And most psychics, when they're doing a reading, it's right there.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens while they're talking. There's no recording of it unless somebody's recording it. But by then, what I'm doing is I ask the client for, what I say every time, any relevant questions and or photos. Sometimes they'll send me questions only. Sometimes they'll be a little bit more descriptive.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes not at all.
Yeah.
Sometimes a photo, maybe with a name, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
From there, I do what I call an advanced reading. And I usually spend twice as much time doing my advanced reading, which is all written, before I ever talk to the client.
Oh.
And so when I'm talking to the client, I'm verifying every single bit of data, or trying to, as much as I can.
Mm-hmm. So feedback becomes very important.
Feedback is key, but that's what Ingo Swann always said.
Yeah.
Feedback is key. You've got to get feedback if you're ever going to know whether your method is correct.
That's, in fact, that's the essence of the scientific method right there. You form a hypothesis and you test your hypothesis against feedback from the physical world.
Right. And it does one other thing, and that is it prevents somebody from saying, oh, it was just a cold reading. You could pick up the micro muscle movements, or you got little clues from the whatever. Mm-hmm. It prevents that. It's purely, as I said, with that tiny bit of front loading where they ask a question, as opposed to, say, CRV, where you're just getting, or ARV, you're just getting a number.
Different types of remote viewing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So now what that does for me is, in this giant matrix of potential information, it gives me a beacon. That the question is the beacon. It takes me to a different space-time location, wherever that is, and I then am on what Ingo might have called, this signal pathway, where I'm trying, or I'm not trying, I am picking up whatever crazy information is coming along that I can't make sense of. I'm writing it all down, and then I'm checking with the client. So when they say, oh yeah, that means this or that means that, great. But I then use that as a kind of support for any messaging that I'm giving them afterwards. In other words, if I'm on the signal track on whatever the items are, then I know that what I'm telling them, the probability is that I'm correct. I don't know for sure.
When you say when you're on the signal track, I like that phrase. Is it something that you intuit it right there in the moment?
Yeah, it takes a huge amount of concentration, by the way. Most people don't realize that, or at least for me it does. And maybe, I'm not what you might call a natural psychic. I mean, as far as I know, I wasn't born with it. I learned it. So for me, to get information, you have to stay totally focused on that beacon for as long as you can, which means for me, no interruptions, no music, no noise, nothing, because anything, I become extremely sensitive, because any sensory bit that enters in can potentially be data. So I'm very careful about that.
Now, normally, when we think of the word skeptical, at least for me, I think of it as a line in the sand. And I think everybody draws the line differently. And they say, if it's on this side of the line, I'll accept it. But once it crosses the line, it's no longer acceptable. But what I'm hearing from you is that's not how you approach it. You're not drawing a line in the sand anywhere.
Well, once you get into this line of work, you know that you don't know. So how can you draw a line? I mean, that's just logical. You have to be open to a possibility that you don't know something.
Mm-hmm.
And most people really dread that.
Yeah.
And it throws all their systems into chaos.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mind it. And maybe you have to be a little bit fearless to do that.
Yeah. I mean, suppose I do a reading and I come up with something that seems totally nonsensical, like Nancy has 10 brains.
Well, 11, but.
I mean, in other words, your skepticism doesn't mean that you have to rule anything out automatically.
You should. The only things that I would be careful of is, and I know that Ingo was trying to really hone in on that and qualify it, is when let's say, your total picture image becomes locked in and you sort of can't get that picture or that thought out of your brain.
Yeah.
But you have to be really careful with that, because that can also mean that you've really locked in.
Yeah.
But so it's a matter of, this is all discernment, and you do this by practicing a lot over time, and you start to understand the very, very subtle differences in that.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole idea is to keep your thoughts as malleable as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Don't rein them in, don't pull them. When I see things psychically, it used to bother me. People, psychics would say, "Oh, well, I see so-and-so's dead father over there," or "I see a red locomotive." Really?
Mm-hmm.
Where'd you see it?
Yeah.
So I needed somebody, because I guess I'm a simple person. I need things explained easily.
Yeah.
Where did you see it? Then I realized, for me, I see shadows.
Mm-hmm.
I see very weird amorphous shapes.
Mm-hmm.
I then have to go and start to say to myself, well, what does that remind me of? What does it feel like? What is it? Not what I think it is. What is it sort of feeling like if I were to give this some kind of a label? I've gotten to a point now when I do associative remote viewing, which is that it's a binary choice, basically, to produce predict a future outcome.
Usually used for speculation and wagering.
Correct. And usually you're given two. There will be two photos. You won't see them. You'll give a coordinate, but it will refer to two photographs. One is, say, winning, one the other's losing, up, down, whatever.
Buy, sell.
There you go. And you have to pick the one that will win in the future, whichever. I've gotten to the point now when I'm trying to tune into that, I don't see in my mind's eye anymore that amorphous shape that I'm trying to figure out what the heck is that.
Yeah.
I literally now see it with my eyes on a blank page, and I draw over the lines. So I think there's a point when it comes out of your mind and you're able to actually project it like on a screen.
Well, I get the impression that over time and with a lot of practice, you're in effect programming your psyche to provide the information to you in a usable format.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a muscle. It's like anything else.
Yeah.
And you have to use it that way. And you do open up. A lot of people don't like to do that because they start to feel insane.
Yeah.
And I'm very serious when I say that. They feel out of control, that their imagery and thoughts are coming too fast, and they're not grounded.
Yeah.
So you have to be really careful to also ground yourself. Some people can get lost out there.
Well, I gather that your skepticism is in effect for yourself to avoid that kind of ungrounded state.
My skepticism, I think, is not so much about the groundedness. I think it's about the lack of trust in my sensory capacities. I know what I can trust.
Yeah.
I can trust analytic information.
Right.
I like that. It's concrete. I can go back to it.
Yeah.
But this other stuff, I think it goes straight to your identity, in a sense. You don't know who you are when you're not allowed to think. I don't know how to say it better than that.
You don't know who you are when you're not allowed to think. Well, that's a good thing. in a way, not to know who you are.
For some people, yeah. But if you like to be in control of your reality, as a lot of people like, that's tough.
Well, I mean, we're going a little bit around in circles here, so I want to kind of hone in on this, because on the one hand, not knowing who you are means that you can let go of a lot of perhaps false images that we've conditioned to think about ourselves. I believe everybody has false images about who they are. So letting go of all of that is a good thing. Yeah. It gets you in touch with maybe a larger sense of yourself.
I think a lot of people do that with religion, because they can sort of identify with a larger consciousness, and one that sort of maybe helps them to put their smaller reality into a context. Yeah. And they can also lose themselves in it.
Yeah. But that's not what you're doing.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I just have a really hard time trusting. I am apparently not hypnotizable, and I know that's a trust issue. I learned how to hypnotize people when I was 8 years old. I've been hypnotizing people for a long time, but
Well, not everybody is a natural hypnotic subject, but you have studied mediumship, so you go into trance, I presume.
It took me a long time, and I will only put myself into trance. So yeah, I can go into a light trance, sure. Yes, and that is a form of self-hypnosis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but now let's come back to this issue, because if I heard you rightly, you were saying that letting go of your sense of yourself is really not what you want to do when you're doing psychic work. You want to maintain a sense of yourself.
I do. That's interesting you're asking that. I think part of that is getting to know your imagery, getting to know what feels right, what doesn't feel right, what you can trust, what you can follow, and how far out you can expand your reach. I used to know a psychic detective. She's passed away now. Her name was Annette Martin.
I knew her.
Did you?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, that's funny.
I've interviewed Annette Martin.
Oh, how funny.
Yeah.
And I remember in the way back, and I didn't know anything, and I said, this aura thing that everybody talks about. I mean, I said, do you have an aura? Well, of course I do. How big is your aura? Oh, I can puff it out as much as I want. She told me I can, if she's in a classroom, she'll puff it out to like 20 feet. And I'm thinking, well, that's peculiar. But then I remember somebody, I had just had foot surgery. Somebody was doing some, I think it was polarity therapy, something on, and they weren't touching. I had my eyes closed, and I said, oh, that hurts when you touch my foot there. They said, really? I said, yeah. Can you move out? Okay, I've moved out. I'm moving out now. No, you're still touching my foot. Anyway, this went on and on. When I finally opened my eyes, the woman was standing over on the other corner of the room. So even our physical sense, we're very expansive. We just don't know that.
So for you, self-knowledge, being aware of who you are, implies being aware of this larger than the physical body part of yourself.
Oh, definitely. I mean, to the point where, if you really realize what any matter is anyway, and if we're just matter, then we're not really here. So, and I know that sounds a little bit esoteric or a little ridiculous, but we're not really here.
It sounds kind of woo-woo, but
and that's fine. Yeah. And I'm so over woo-woo. Woo-woos, and a lot of people are getting over woo-woo. But the point is, you can bilocate. I've been told that I've shown up across the country in people's rooms where there've been more than one person who've seen me and heard me. Do I remember that? No. All I know is that my physical body seems to be what I'm aware of, but I know that I can be many places simultaneously, as well as being here or not here. Doesn't really matter, which is why I don't think that the physical brain generates consciousness. And that's a whole topic that has been absorbing an awful lot of people.
Yes, indeed. It's becoming a hot topic.
Yeah.
As more and more people begin to digest the data of parapsychology, they have to begin to think of the mind in new ways, not completely dependent upon the brain.
Right. And I think if you read enough, books by people who've had, whether they're out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, whether they're doing remote viewing or bilocation or you name it, or even dreams that are lucid dreams or dreams that are predictive, you realize we're more than what we think we are right here in this particular space.
Yeah. So your skepticism, from what I'm hearing, is directed not only to the particulars of your methodology and making sure you're working with feedback, but also I think you have a very healthy skepticism of many of the, I'm going to call them conventional falsehoods that we've all been educated to accept.
Oh, sure. I'll give you another example. What I included into my methodology, this TSP, is
the skeptical psychic.
Well, yes, it seemed to work with that too. Right. Or tested ESP. Anyway, another factor that I've added in is not just being able to view bits of data in advance, with, as they say, being shielded or blocked by distance or time. So you're not just putting in those bits of data, but I also have added a new category of synchronicity. And synchronicity, depending on how you look at it, because you have to look at it's just a meaningful coincidence. Well, what does meaningful mean? Meaningful means that you have reorganized your concept of cause and effect, so that something has happened that made it meaningful, that there were two different events or something that occurred that gave it value.
Right.
And what's interesting is, since I really started heavily documenting my case studies, let me put it that way, is that almost half of them have extraordinary synchronicities. So I'll add that into the mix. That weighs in the favor of a confirmation.
Almost half of what?
My little readings.
Your readings.
Yes.
Okay.
So, for example, there's so many examples. There was a man who wanted a reading. He was an accident victim. He wanted a reading. He was quite upset with his attorney, who was withholding settlement funds, wouldn't contact him for 2 years, wouldn't talk to him. And the guy was upset. He wanted to know what to do. We're talking on the phone. I'm giving his reading. Suddenly a woman's voice interrupts. And we all say, hello, who is this? And there was nobody else in his house. And it was not like a third party interrupt. It was not like that.
A party line.
Right. Turns out, and the woman, he says, who is this? She says, well, why did you call me? He said, I didn't. She said, well, I'm your attorney's paralegal. She then put the office manager on, and within 1 day, he received his settlement money.
I see.
I grilled him for several days, saying, did you push a button? Did you do something? Is it possible? Do you have 2 lines in your house? What could have done that? There was zero explanation for it. Now, if you add that as a synchronicity to which is highly relevant to the topic of the reading, you've now created a form of a confirmation on that psychic transaction.
What a fascinating topic. It really is, Nancy. We could be exploring this forever, because you're dealing with, to me, when you first started to bring up synchronicities, I thought to myself, oh yes, synchronicities, it's the universe is speaking, but it's more than that. You're talking about something we touched on earlier in our previous interview about Ingo Swann. We're talking about multiple dimensions of time and space, and the way the universe isn't just speaking; it's the universe is actually acting in concert.
Exactly. It's very, very interactive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Nancy du Tertre, this has been a real pleasure. I know, once again, we're just scratching the surface on very, very deep and profound topics, but it's such a pleasure to share this time with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with me. And thank you for being with us.